Hey fam, welcome or welcome back. Tisha here, back for another reading. Our newest reading is called, as you can tell by the thumbnail, Lost Boy. It is by Brent W. Jeffs with Mia Salovich. The true story of one man's exile from a polygamous cult and his brave journey to reclaim his life. Go ahead and do me a favor and hit the like button. As you all know, if you've been here before, I may not always pronounce things correctly. I make comments here and there, but either way, we get it done. Thank you guys for joining me. Also, if you're new here, in the thumbnail, when I feel like something may be triggering, I normally put the warning symbol up there just so that you're prepared that there may be a part of the reading that may, cause you to get angrier than usual or more upset or concerned or whatever. It may trigger something in you. So that's what that sign means. Let's go ahead and start with the back of the cover. It says, in the Polygamous Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, FLDS, girls can become valuable property as plural wives, but boys are expendable. I personally feel like girls are expendable as well. The way that they sell them off and stuff like that, I don't think that that's a value, but we're going to go with what it says here. They're expendable, even a liability. In this powerful and heartbreaking account, former FLDS member Brent Jeffs reveals both the terror and the love he experienced growing up on his prophet's compound and the harsh exile existence that so many boys face once they have been expelled by the sect. Brent Jeffs, starting off wrong already, is the nephew of Warren Jeffs, the imprisoned leader of the FLDS, the son of a prominent family in the church. Brent could have grown up to have multiple wives of his own and significant power in the 10,000 strong community, but he knew that behind the group's pious public image, women in chaste dresses carrying babies on their hips lay a much darker reality. So he walked away and was the first to file a sexual abuse lawsuit against his uncle. Wow. Now Brent shares his courageous story and that of many other young men who've become lost boys when they leave the FLDS either by choice or by expulsion. Brent experienced firsthand the absolute power that church leaders wield, the kind of power that corrupts and perverts those who will do anything to maintain it. Once young men no longer belong to the church, they are cast out into the world for which they are utterly unprepared. More often than not, they succumb to the temptations of alcohol or other drugs. It's so sad that these guys go through this. In this moving and powerful memoir, Brent recounts his story of struggle, triumph, and redemption that will inspire readers for years to come. Brent is the nephew of Warren Jeffs and the grandson of Rulon Jeffs, the Mormon fundamentalist group former prophet, who had dozens of wives and more than 60 children. Brent spent his entire childhood in the Jeffs compound. He currently lives in Salt Lake City with his beautiful wife and daughter. Mia Salovich is the author and co-author of several books, including Help at Any Cost, How the Troubled Teen Industry Cons Parents and Hurts Kids. She has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Elle as a senior fellow at stats.org, a media watchdog group. She lives in New York. That is the back of this cover. Now let's see what Lost Boy says. In the front, it says, for Clayne and David. Author's note: this is my true story, based on my memories and the recollections of people close to me. Memory is never perfect, but I have done my best to accurately portray the unique world that shaped me. Some names have been changed to protect privacy. That's how you know they're going to be talking about some stuff. When they change names, it's going to be real. Prologue. I woke up drenched in sweat. screaming. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. My throat was dry and raw as sand. Jody, my then fiance, now wife, was trying to calm me. She was holding me, rocking me, gently touching my hair. It's okay, it's okay, it's only a dream, she said. I was safe in my bed at home in Salt Lake City, suburb of Bluffdale, wrapped up in the black and yellow leopard pattern comforter I'd kept from my bachelor days. Jody was with me, but in my mind I was back in Alta Academy, the private religious school run by my uncle Warren Jeffs. Warren is now the prophet of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, FLDS, a Mormon splinter sect of about 10,000 people who believe that the church erred when it abandoned polygamy. Back then, he was the principal of my school. My dad, his 3 wives, and all 20 of us children had been born into the church. In my dream, Warren was holding my hand. His hand seemed huge and mine was tiny. He's 6'4", gawky, scrawny, and awkward. He is a funny looking man. His neck is too skinny for his head, and his glasses are too big for his face. His hair and eyes are a muddy brown. It seemed to me like the rest of him was really far away, like his hand came down toward mine from an incredible height. I was in a small, cramped classroom. The kids around me were little ones, preschoolers and kindergartens, my youngest cousins. That minute must have been a Sunday, during Jeff's family church. My dad has more than 65 brothers and sisters. His father had about 19 wives at the time. Every other Sunday, our whole family would have our own special services led by my grandfather, who was then the prophet. To keep the little kids occupied while the adults worshiped, we were sent into classrooms in the basement and allowed to play, watched over by teenage sisters or cousins who had been assigned babysitting duty. That's where I was when Warren tapped my shoulder and grabbed my hand. I followed him like you do when an uncle takes your hand and you are 5. I don't know what about this is making me nervous, but I'm anxious. He took me into the hallway, which was paneled in dark wood and narrow. There were many doors along the corridor. One opened. I saw a flash of a bathroom with some pale blue tiles, and then terror. Jody says I was screaming in my sleep. No, stop, please, don't touch me. She tried to wake me, but couldn't immediately. All I remember feeling was overwhelming panic, pain, and helplessness. Something terrible was going to happen to me, something horrendous and unstoppable. I was small and powerless and couldn't do anything about it, and it would hurt beyond words. I knew this with complete certainty because I realized whatever it was, it had happened to me before. Oh, boy. Now I dreaded it more than anything, even death. I felt frozen, just blank with fear and powerlessness. As I began to wake up, I thought my body had been paralyzed. I tried to scream, tried to move my arms, legs, fingers, toes, but nothing worked. Not a sound seemed to come from my mouth, and my limbs wouldn't move. I knew the pain would take over soon. I wasn't able to protect myself. Every single part of me was electrified by terror and apprehension. I jumped. Jody had snapped me out of it, and now I saw her and realized where I was. My heart was still speeding, but it began to slow. I didn't know, or really I didn't want to know, what had just terrorized me. I've been having similar nightmares for months. They seemed so real, I didn't want to think about why. I did know that my brother Clayne had been raped by Warren at Alta Academy. Oh my goodness. When he was just 5 years old. That made me flash on an image of Clayne's body after he'd shot himself. Another thing I was trying to forget. You guys, we're just in the prologue, And I am going to have to put a warning symbol up here. This is going to be a book. It hadn't been more than a year ago now, but I still felt like it had just happened and still didn't want to believe it was true. Asleep, I sometimes managed to forget my grief. Now I was beginning to think that the abuse that had driven my oldest brother to suicide was something I'd have to confront as well. I started thinking back to what had happened when I left church and how I gotten to the point that I had to leave. I thought of my life as a lost boy. That's what the media came to call the hundreds of young men like me who had been forced out of the church to provide more young women for Warren and his followers. I thought about how that life had affected my brothers, and as I sifted through my memories, my life came to me in bits and pieces, often disconnected, just like my dreams. Even normal memory has gaps, but traumatic memory is even more discontinuous. That's so true. This is my story, which put me back together. Oh, guys, this is going to be good. I think my son picked a good one. Chapter 1, Heaven or Hell. Every child believes he's special, but when you are number 10 of 20 with 3 sister mothers, 2 of whom are full-blooded sisters, and a grandfather whom thousands of people believe speaks directly to God, it can be hard to figure out what special really means. All told, I have roughly 65 aunts and uncles on my dad's side and 22 on my mom's. Can y'all believe that? Can you guys believe? That's an astonishing number. These are aunts and uncles. I got a lot of aunts and uncles. We're not in the 60s and the 20s on, but that is a lot of aunts and uncles. With probably thousands of cousins and families as large as mine. Even keeping track of your own siblings, let alone cousins and aunts and uncles, is difficult. As a grandson of Rulon Jeffs and a nephew of Warren Jeffs, it once seemed that I was destined for high honor in the FLDS. My family had what our church called royal blood. We were direct descendants of our prophet through my father's line. My mother, too, is the child of a prophet who split from her group in 1978 to lead his own polygamous sect. When I was little, my family was I wonder if that was one of the LeBarons. When I was little, my family was favored in the church's elite. I was assured that there was a place for me in the highest realms of heaven and at least 3 wives for me right here on earth once I attained the, I don't know how to say this, Melchizedek, Melchizedek, I know I butchered that, priesthood. I was in a chosen family, in a chosen people, visiting sacred land near end times. I would one day become a God ruling over my own spinning world. That just doesn't make any sense to me. That's the part that really, really gets me about these cults, right? And I know we all have different beliefs, but that just sounds crazy. Why would you? Okay, anyways. So why would I ever abandon such status and rank? In the world of the FLDS, things are not always what they seem. The shiny, smiling surface often hide a world of rot and pain. And even royal blood and being born male can't protect you from sudden changes in its convoluted power structure. Outsiders tend to think our form of polygamy must be a great deal for us men. You get sexual variety without guilt. In fact, you are commanded by God to have multiple partners, and the women are expected to go along with it. Indeed, they are supposed to be happy about doing so and obediently serve you. This is the only way for all of you to get to the highest realms of heaven. I'll be honest, I often feel like the men have it easier, but I'm interested in hearing his story. To many men, that sounds like heaven right there, without any need for the afterlife part. They focus on sex, fantasizing about a harem of young, beautiful women all at their beck and call. They don't think about the responsibility or the balancing act needed to keep all those women happy, or even just to minimize their complaints. During the 1 full year I attended public school, the few guys who befriended me rather than ridiculing me were fascinated by it all. But while it might seem good in theory, in practice, at least in my experience, it's actually a recipe for misery for everyone involved. That I believe. In the FLDS, anyway, polygamy and its power structure continuously produce a constant, exhausting struggle for attention and resources. In families as large as mine, it simply isn't possible for all of the women and children to get their needs met. Just making sure the children are fed, clothed, and physically accounted for is an ongoing challenge. Simply keeping dozens of children physically safe is close to impossible. I'd estimate that maybe 1 in 5 FLDS families has lost a child early in life. Oh my goodness. Frequently from accidents that better supervision could have prevented. While he's saying this, I couldn't help but think, I think it was it in Rachel's book? We read a few books where the mothers had their children being injured. I remember Rachel's book, Warren didn't give permission for her child to go to the hospital. This is true. There's a few books that we've read where kids have gotten severely injured or hurt or lost their life, like what happened in Ruth's book with her mom and siblings. Like, this is true. This is true because of carelessness and because there's so many bodies and there's not enough supervision. And that number doesn't include deaths related to the genetic disorder that runs in our church, which handicaps and often kills children very early in life, but which many members refuse to see as a result of marriages among closely related families, because they're marrying their relatives and procreating, and it's causing abnormalities amongst their children, yet they're still doing it. Sad. For the father, even though he is at the top of the heap in his own family, he must constantly disappoint, reject, ignore, or fail to satisfy at least some wives and kids. There's only so much of his time and attention to go around, and supporting such a large family takes many hours too. At home, if one person has your ear, someone else doesn't. Yes to one wife is no to others. And if a man wants more wives, he will have to engage in his own highly competitive fight for status and influence with the higher ups in the church. Then there's the math problem. Half of all children born are boys. Of course, for some men to have many wives, others are either going to have to leave, recruit new women into polygamy, which is a difficult task, unsurprisingly, and one rarely attempted by the FLDS, or go unmarried. Consequently, being born a boy in the FLDS is not the privileged position it first seems to be. Unless you are willing to go toe-to-toe to leaders and attempt perfect obedience with constantly changing demands and hierarchies, you are likely either to be expelled or to have a hard time getting even one wife, let alone the required 3. Just on the numbers alone, you will need a lot of luck to avoid losing everything as you hit manhood. Being born into the right family, like I was, is a good start. However, it may not be good enough. Once people get over their titillation and harem fantasies and think through these issues, they start wondering why anyone stays. How can you believe such strange things, they asked. Why didn't you leave years earlier? And how could those parents marry their teenage daughters off to old men, abandon their sons, or give up their wives and children at Warren's command? That's the part that I struggle with the most in this. Not just the fact that you're giving them away, but you're giving them away at such a young age, their children, and you know what's going to happen to them because they don't want this. So you're knowingly and willingly putting them in a situation where they're going to be assaulted. They are, because they don't want it, but they're being forced to do it. And that's what I struggle with when it comes to this stuff. The answer is tangled in family loyalties, family history, and a church that has become expert at using these bonds to move beliefs into brainwashing. On my father's side, I come from around 6 generations of polygamy. My mother's history is similar. Our families have lived polygamy since Joseph Smith first introduced the principle of celestial marriage in 1843, and the same is true for most members. One reason we stay is that this is the only life we know. Another is that leaving involves giving up contact with basically every single family member and friend you have. Sometimes everyone you know, period. That's what makes it hard for a lot of them. It's that piece where you don't know the next time you're going to be able to talk or be around your family. And 2, there's the fact that you have been kept ignorant of the way the rest of the world works. You have been indoctrinated nearly every single day of your life to believe that all of the other peoples are evil, wish to harm you, and are damned by God unchosen. It's weird, but even if you truly don't believe what they have told you, some part of you remains frightened that they might be right, and that fear and your fear of losing everyone you love is at the heart of what traps people. Then there's the weight of family history and tradition. My great-grandfather, David W. Jeffs, was born in 1873 and baptized in the Mormon Church when polygamy was officially part of the religion. Founder Joseph Smith had begun practicing polygamy before he preached it. The identity of his second wife is disputed because the ceremony took place in secret without even the knowledge of his first wife, who vigorously opposed the whole idea. As Smith's biographer Fawn Brody wrote, Joseph Smith believed in the good life. Man is that he might have joy, had been one of his first significant pronouncements in the Book of Mormon. The prophet's belief in the rightness of things that gave him joy meant that he couldn't see having more than one wife is sinful. That just didn't make sense to him. Of course, a prophet couldn't have a mistress, and so celestial marriage was born. It is not known how many wives Joseph Smith had, but the number is believed to be around 50. See, that's the thing. Everybody quotes a different number. Like, Joseph Smith was doing some stuff. Because the number, like, I heard 30-something. We've heard 40-something. I think, was it 40-something that we heard on Big Love or 30-something? Like, we've heard a lot of different wives. Joseph Smith's revelation on plural wives was grounded in the Old Testament and in our church. It's sometimes called the Law of Sarah, who was Abraham's first wife. The Jewish patriarchs and kings of the Old Testament were polygamous, while the rest of Christianity accepts the New Testament and rejects polygamy. Fundamentalist Mormons believe that the Book of Mormon supersedes the New Testament in the way that the New Testament updates the Old. Joseph Smith's 1843 revelation on polygamy was personally directed at his resistant first wife. He was tired of hiding his other wives from her and everyone else and wanted it all out in the open. So because you did this against your first wife, like a lot of these guys do, because you felt like this is what you wanted, and you didn't see anything wrong with having more wives. You basically, it sounds like, in my opinion, wrote this to get back at her, but we'll see. He wrote that God told him, I command mine handmaid, Emma Smith, to receive all those that have been given unto my servant Joseph. Yeah, that's exactly what he did. And cleave unto my servant Joseph, and to no one else. If she will not abide this commandment, she shall be destroyed. I would love to see what would happen if she didn't do it. I wish she didn't do it so she could prove that he was lying and she wouldn't have been destroyed. But I digress. Believe this to be a true revelation. Oh, believing this to be a true revelation, Emma complied. And just like that, all these people, oh, goodness gracious. Still, she didn't hesitate to expel from her home the women she believed her husband was favoring. And according to some, she once demanded her own spiritual husbands as fair play. I mean, that's my thing. Why is it that just the men can do it? Needless to say, a revelation making this practice into gospel was never received by Joseph Smith. The rest of the doctrine on plural marriage is written this way. If any man expose a virgin and desire to, am I saying that right? Expose, or is it espouse? Siri, how do you say E-S-P-O-U-S-E? I mean, Alexa, how do you say E-S-P-O-U-S-E?
Okay, but which language do you want me to translate to?
English. She didn't help me at all. I'm hoping I'm saying it right. Another, and the first give her consent, and if he is that espouse the second, and they are virgins, and have vowed to no other man, then he is justified. He cannot commit adultery. And if he have 10 virgins given unto him by this law, he cannot commit adultery, for they belong to him. Given Emma's objections, clearly, Joseph Smith had a very flexible definition of consent. Exactly. Unfortunately, that probably had a great influence on the fundamentalist church. Yeah, because you're saying that she has to accept it, yet the wife didn't, but you still picked up wives. And oddly, despite the prohibition against marrying those who have vowed to another man, many of the first Mormon plural wives also had other husbands. What? Some had left their spouses to join the church and were essentially separated. But others were married first to other Mormon men, then to leaders like Joseph Smith, who had decided that they wanted those particular women for themselves. Being lower in the church hierarchy, many men accepted this. Some even saw it as an honor. Probably for public relations purposes, the marriages of the church leaders to women with other husbands were originally presented as unions that were for eternity, but not for time. In other words, they weren't supposed to involve sex here on earth. However, accounts of time suggest that these marriages were consummated and indeed sometimes produced children. In the FLDS, when a polygamous marriage is entered into, it is sealed by the prophet for both time and for eternity. My former church doesn't just preach multiple wives, however, it also preaches multiple gods and multiple heavens. Understanding this is important to understand what happened to my family and how the FLDS works. Joseph Smith preached that God himself was once as we are now. And Lorenzo Snow, the fifth president of the LDS Church, wrote, as man as God once was, and as God is, man may become. That's a very exciting idea for many people. And you can see why it might have helped the early church attract converts. But by the 1860s, this transformation from man to God began to require the practice of polygamy. As Brigham Young proclaimed, the only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy. Others attain unto a glory, but they could not reign as kings in glory because they had blessings offered unto them and they refused to accept them. The idea that one should never reject a blessing is a cornerstone of the FLDS belief system, one that would also have a profound impact on my family and my life. As you'll see, there were several blessings that we truly could have lived without, but my parents didn't feel that they could reject them. Few people in the church felt they could challenge this doctrine. That would mean failing at another key objective in the church, being obedient. The FLDS conception of heaven is complicated too. In our religion, it's not getting into heaven that counts, it's getting into the right heaven. There are 3 realms. The highest and most glorious is the celestial, which can be entered only by men who have had at least 3 wives in polygamy. Here, men become godlike and rule over their own planets. The reason that FLDS members have so many children, in fact, is to populate their personal planets. In the celestial realm, plural wives become queens who bear celestial children. Yeah, women get the raw deal even in the highest realm of heaven in our religion. I'm glad that he said it because that's exactly what it sounds like. The middle realm is terrestrial. This is somewhat like purgatory in Catholicism and is for people who never knew the teachings of Joseph Smith and Jesus Christ, but is still supposed to be pretty glorious. The lowest realm is celestial, which is for people who refuse to worship God. This is not hell, it's just kind of like a mediocre heaven. Hell is reserved for the worst of sinners who refuse to repent and continue to wallow in sin. They are called sons or daughters of perdition. Not surprisingly, as a World of Mormon views on polygamy and men becoming gods first became public, the Gentile was shocked and outraged. At the time of Joseph Smith's polygamy revelation, Mormons had already fled to both Ohio and Missouri. In the case of Missouri, it was under threat of extermination by the governor. It was non-Mormon fury over polygamy and over Joseph Smith's growing political power that led to his assassination in 1844 in an Illinois jail and to the subsequent migration to Utah led by Brigham Young. The main LDS Church banned polygamy in 1890 to pave the way for Utah statehood, which was granted in 1896. The manifesto that prohibited plural marriage made clear that the ban was being imposed only because the practice was illegal and the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that laws against it were constitutional. But the LDS didn't begin excommunicating polygamists until 1904. I don't know when my father's family converted to Mormonism, but when the polygamy ban took effect, my great-grandfather, David W. Jeffs, had already married plural wives in the church and refused to give them up. He sided with the men who would become the first leaders of the FLDS. They believed that Mormon leaders who accepted the end of polygamy were not the true holders of the keys to the holy priesthood preached by Smith. These keys are important because in Mormon belief, only those who have been given them by a legitimate authority can truly be prophets. Without them, prophets have no authority, and men could not receive true revelation. Lines of patriarchal authority through these keys and through blood shape most aspects of life in the fundamentalist church. My great-grandfather believed that these sacred keys had been passed to the FLDS leadership during an event known as the 8-hour meeting. This occurred in 1886. At the time, John Taylor was the president and prophet of the whole LDS church. He was living underground to avoid federal prosecution for polygamy. Lauren Woolley, who would become a prophet of the FLDS, guarded the door to the room where Taylor was staying the night before the meeting. He said that it had no door to the outside of the house and had covered the windows. According to his account, I was suddenly attracted to a light appearing under the door leading to the President Taylor's room and was at once startled to hear the voices of men talking there. I was bewildered because it was my duty to keep people out of that room, and evidently someone had entered without my knowing it. Woolley said that Taylor told him the next day that the voices that he had heard had been those of your Lord and Joseph Smith, and that they had instructed him not to sign a manifesto banning polygamy. Ruley wrote that at the 8-hour meeting, Taylor placed his finger on the document, his person rising from the floor about a foot or 18 inches, and said that he would sooner have his tongue or arm cut off than sign it. He then gave 5 men who were at the meeting the right to perform polygamous marriages. He made them swear that they would ensure that no year passed by without children being born in the principle of plural marriage. Isn't it interesting how this is what we're being told, right? We're being given all this information, which I get is the beginning of the chapter. Everybody wants to tell you about what, their belief system is or was. But isn't it interesting that every year a child is supposed to be born? Yet we know in other readings that Warren Jeffs at one point told the people that they were not allowed to have intimate relations with their spouses. So that alone means he's contradicting what their belief is. The first 2 prophets of the FLDS Church were among the 5 selected to carry out these marriages. But while great-grandfather David Jeff sided with the fundamentalists, my grandfather, Rulon, who was born in 1909, became opposed to polygamy as a young man. He was baptized into the LDS and became estranged from his fundamentalist father. Tall and handsome in his youth, Rulon had mischievous brown eyes and chestnut brown hair. Although his hairline started receding quite early, he trained as an accountant, and after a mission to England during the Great Depression, he took a job in Salt Lake City with the Utah State Taxation Committee. I'm making up my own words. State Tax Commission. Clearly, seen as a man of promise by the LDS, my grandfather Rulon was permitted to marry Zola Brown, the daughter of one of the highest ranking leaders of the church, known as an apostle. After he had his first son, however, Rulon reconnected with his father. David soon convinced him that he should live polygamy, but Rulon ran into the same problems with his first wife that Joseph Smith had. She did not want to share him. Although Rulon built their new home with a basement accommodations for a second wife, unlike Emma Smith, Zola Jeffs utterly refused to submit. Go ahead, girl. Yes. When Rulon told her in July 1940 that a mountaintop revelation had shown him that God had destinated a cute young shop clerk, in Provo to be his second wife, Zola broke down. According to their divorce papers, she became so worried and upset that she cried almost day and night, that her milk dried up, so she was no longer able to nurse her baby. Wow. She took the couple's 2 small children and moved to California. 2 weeks after a judge granted the divorce in 1941, Rulon was excommunicated by the LDS. My grandfather, however, was not to be deterred. He didn't even go to his own LDS church trial. He wrote, "For the first time I say, I will put God's work before anything else in my life." He joined a group led by John Y. Barlow, who was the FLDS prophet from 1935 to 1949. In 1986, Grandfather Rulon would himself become the prophet. And that put my family right at the center of an organization that was extremely loyal to its leaders. The church reflected and amplified both its leaders' good sides and flaws. With a relaxed leadership, the FLDS was mighty peculiar, but not particularly perverse. There was child abuse and domestic violence in some families, but there is no way of knowing whether the abuse was more common in our church than anywhere else at the time. The problem was the FLDS growing isolation and a change in leadership structure that would inevitably produce corruption. Before my grandfather came to power, there had been a leadership council that ran the church. This council was more powerful than most religious hierarchies because, at least in Colorado City and Hydale, where 2/3 of the FLDS lived at the time, most people's houses were owned by the church, not by people who lived in them. This occurred through a system that became known as the United Effort Plan. Okay, this right here is reminding me very much so of Big Love. They have the UEB and they own everybody's businesses and houses and stuff. This is what this is giving me right here. Okay. The communal arrangement was based on one used by the early Mormons. The council provided at least some checks on the prophet's control over the group. It ensured that he did not have absolute power over both theology and property. But part of what brought grandfather to the prophet's position was his opposition to that council and his belief in what they called one man rule. A dispute over this issue splintered the FLDS in the late 1970s and in the early 1980s. My grandfather's position swayed the majority who stayed, with the belief that the prophet should have absolute power. Rulon would eventually have this power for himself, and this set the stage for his son, Warren, who would use the idea that he was God's special messenger to do unspeakable evil without any voice of reason or earthly authority to stop him. And that is where we're going to stop, because that is the end of the chapter. I know how we feel sometimes when we're given a whole bunch of information, especially because some of it we've already heard. But I do enjoy getting the backstory of why they came to be where they are. You guys, even though, we just heard a whole bunch of of doctrine and stuff, I think that this is going to be a good one. I need to find what that word is, because that bothered me. That expose about where is it? I'm looking for it because I'm gonna have to look that one up, because I know I butchered that. Anyways, thanks guys so much for joining. Like the video. Let me know what you thought of this, basically this first chapter. Until next time.